And this is a tool that we developed here at the National Drought Mitigation Center, the Drought Risk Atlas, basically giving people the opportunity to look at historical drought events that go back further than just the 20-year period of record associated with the drought monitor. And so with the Drought Atlas, I'm going to kind of just do a walkthrough of some of the tools that you can see and use within this, and some of the capabilities that we built into it. So when I look at the Drought Risk Atlas, what I am looking at is the historical drought data for multiple stations across the United States. We also included some hydrology stations through there as well. And the idea was let's take the best long-term, most complete weather stations in the country, and let's calculate the period of record drought indices as far back as we can go. So for each of the 5,000 stations that are in the database, we went through and looked at the characteristics of that station. We've also looked at how big of gaps historically were in those data sets. And we wanted to take those stations that had a long, complete period of record available and calculate some of these drought indices going back. And so when we start looking at some of the more historical drought periods that we've seen in the region, it gives us the ability to go back, and this is on a station base, that we can go and look at the information taking us further back in time to just get a better idea, okay, how are today's conditions really comparing to what we've seen for drought over the last 50, 60 to 100 years. Most of these stations, every station that we have included has at least 40 years of data, and most stations have between 65 and 80 years of data. So you do get a little bit better perspective on those wet and dry periods looking at these drought indices. And so what we have included in the Drought Atlas are the Standardized Precipitation Index, or SPI, the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, or SPEI, the Palmer, which is the PDSI, the self-calibrated Palmer. We also have the drought monitor data in there for the last 20 years. And then for the hydrology stations, we use the Standardized Streamflow Index, basically using the same program that's used to calculate the SPI, but apply that to the historical streamflows, and you get the Standardized Streamflow Index. Again,
hey,
there's
Brian.
yeah.
We're having a couple of people saying that you're a little difficult to understand. I don't know if it's your speakers or it's a little crackly, maybe.
Okay, let me turn off my camera and see if that helps. Shouldn't be having any issues. Is that any better?
I think so.
Okay, I'll just continue then.
So, maybe somebody said it sounds like you're maybe too close to the mic. I don't know. I think it's a little better with your camera. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a little over 5,000 stations in the database. 4,000 of those, a little over 4,000 are climate stations, and just over 900 are hydrology. We've also calculated some trend data for these stations, as well as some maps. There's some gridded weekly maps of drought indices going all the way back to 1910. And through this process, we did a cluster analysis of the climate stations because we wanted people that were not near a climate station to know which stations in their areas behaved in a similar fashion. And so we developed 139 unique climate regimes. And so within each one of those climate regimes, all the stations and also the area in between those stations, statistically, they do behave in a similar fashion. So that's just some background on the atlas. Okay. And this is just a graphic of showing where those climate stations are, and the red lines are showing the climate regimes, those 139 unique regions that we identified. And this is really where you jump into the Drought Risk Atlas. And I apologize for not putting it on, and maybe Tanya, you can share it when we get done here, is the URL for the Drought Atlas. It's droughtatlas.unl.edu, but I didn't share that on any of the slides. I apologize. So basically, when you do come into the Drought Atlas, We have precipitation and temperature data. For those stations that are precipitation only, of course, that temperature data is not going to be included. Then you get into the drought indices. You can see along the top of the slide here, each one of those drought indices has their own tab. And so on each one of these tabs, there's a lot of information associated with the drought indices that you can dig into. So for example, this station is in New Mexico. It's in the east central part of the state. It has a record that goes all the way back to 1917. And so for that period of record, you can see what the SPI looks like. And for this one here, this is a 12-month SPI. You can easily see those wet and dry periods that take place during the period of record where the SPIs will go from very positive to very negative. When we go forward, you can see this data in a tabular sense. So if you wanted to see what the worst SPIs were ever for this station in west central New Mexico, excuse me, then you can go to this table and it's going to show them and when they took place. You can see in the early 2000s, we hit a SPI of almost -3, which basically is saying almost 3 standard deviations from what the normal precipitation would have been for that 12-month period. Then you see some in the 70s and the 50s that stand out as well as some of the more extreme SPIs. And what's kind of unique is when you look at some of that information that Nancy shared in the time series of the drought monitor, none of those areas, besides the first one in 2000, really have showed up. It's mostly in the 50s and 70s. So again, if you're just looking at the drought monitor, you may get a better idea of just the last 20 years for a consolidated index like the drought monitor is, but for individual drought indices, you may have a different signal. What we also built in is the ability to look at the monthly rankings of these indices as well. So again, this is for the 12-month SPI. I pulled it up for August, and you can see again the most extreme SPI values that have occurred. And on the flip side, if you're interested on the wet occurrences, you can resort this by just clicking on that SPI column, and it will automatically take you to the top 10 wettest periods for this particular station as well. What's also nice is currently on the left-hand menu, I have period of record selected, but you can choose individual decades if you want to look at individual decades, and you can also put in a custom time scale. So say you want to compare the last 30 years to what we're currently seeing. You can automatically do that within that menu system. Another tool we built in are these heat maps. And some people are more visual when it comes to some of these drought indices. And so this is for weekly information. And what it allows you to do is you can see the slider bars on the bottom and on the right. You can quickly go through each individual week associated with the 12-month SPI again in this example, and see where those wet and dry periods are. Again, the reds and yellows and oranges are the drier periods, and the greens and blues and purples are the wetter periods. But you also see a lot of white in there. And that's basically saying that, you know, even in this station with some of the extremes that we've seen, there are a lot of periods that are within that normal, which would be from a minus 0.99 to a positive 0.99, or just under 1 standard deviation to the wet or dry side. And that's what we expect with the SPI, that the majority of our data are going to fall. But if you're looking for wet and dry periods, this heat map does a really good job of just helping you quickly to find those, and you can dig into some of the other data a little more easily when you have a time period to zero in on. So this is also some user-defined drought periods. So on the left-hand menu, for this example, I took SPI again, and I said I wanted to know when the 9-month SPI was at a minus 1.5 or worse. And so what it tells you is a summary here, and it tells you when these took place, how long they lasted, when they began, when they ended. It gives you the average duration. So it shows for this station in west central New Mexico that there have been 28 droughts that have fit this category. And when you hit this period of being at minus 1.5 on the SPI or worse, they tend to last a while because the average duration is 42 weeks in length, so almost a year. And when you think about what we've been seeing in the region lately, that does really correlate well with the dryness we've been seeing. That once it sets in, it seems like it's very difficult to get out of those dry periods. Then we've also showed some trends. So again, we want to know how are these stations behaving over time? Are we seeing them become wetter? Are we seeing them become drier? And a lot of times we see this associated with just precipitation and temperature, that an area is described as getting wetter or getting drier or getting warm or getting colder when you start looking at these particular periods. And with the trends information, we do that for precipitation, but we also do them for the drought indices. So when you start thinking about these derived values, and the bottom part of this frame is the water year, you can start seeing that, you know, for this station, there really hasn't been a trend in what we've been seeing for the water year precipitation, or that 12-month SPI during that water year. But when we start looking at annual precipitation days, basically those days that record above 1/100th of an inch, there's a slight trend showing more of these days taking place. And basically it's saying that per decade, we've seen about a little over 4 days more of precipitation than we had through the history. And so these are just some ways to, again, differently look at the data, not only over the entire period of record, but again, if you look at the left-hand menu, you can see that you can choose the start year. And so a lot of discussion has taken place of just how we've seen the climate changing over the last several decades. So for this example, I used the starting year of 1975. You can do 1980, 1985, or you can even look at the entire period of record and just see what those trends are. So that was a good addition to the Drought Risk Atlas here in the last year or so. Again, this is an example of that standardized stream flow index using the hydrology data. So USGS has just under 1,000 stations that they have as part of their historical stream flow network. And these are supposed to be the stations that have been the most unregulated, unmanaged in their network of stations. So typically it's supposed to give you a better idea of, again, what the hydrology is looking like in these regions. And again, this is the standardized stream flow index from the late 60s to present. And again, you can see, again, those wetter periods are going to be your positive numbers and those drier periods are going to be your negative numbers, but you can get an idea on the hydrology. And again, you can choose the time step. So if you're looking at 1 or 2 month type changes, you can choose that. This is more of a longer term 12-month time step, looking at an annual type of basis. We also have these maps going back to 1910. Basically, we've taken the climate data that we have and we've interpolated between the points to come up with these gridded maps. Right now, we have this for the SPI. You can choose any week going back to 1910 and look at what the SPI map would have looked like for that point in time. We are going to be adding all the other indices here in the next 6 months or so as we start a process of remapping some of these since we've updated the data. And again, it's really good to look at. I can pull up right now an SPI map, and if I wanted to compare it to what it looked like at another historical period, I can punch in that period and say, oh yeah, that drought of that period does look similar to what we're seeing today. So again, it really helps in answering some of those questions pretty quickly of when we have had questions come up, well, how does the current period compare to a certain historical drought period? And just this is one example of one of the trend maps as well, looking at how different regions, so the blue dots are basically showing a positive trend, the red dots are showing a negative trend, and the gray dots, it's not statistically significant, so really no trend involved. But you can do that for all the different variables that we have available in the Drought Atlas as well to see what those trends look like. Again, you can choose different starting periods to look at, which is very useful to use just to get an idea, okay, what are we trending towards in this region? Again, we have a lot of partners at NDMC, just a quick shout out to them. And I will end there and take any questions people have with my contact information up there too.
Thank you, Brian. We do have one question, and it looks like that's going to be all we have time for. Dennis is in Southwest Wyoming, and he said there aren't many stations there. And he wondered if there are plans to add any more, or if we know that, I guess, too.
Oh, yeah, that's
Oh, Nancy filled it in here. Brian, you can go ahead. Nancy did type some info in too, though.
yeah. There are a lot of places once you get in the western U.S. that they've never had any weather stations, and so I do know that there have been some studies go on even recently, especially in the upper Missouri River Basin, to look at adding some stations. But even with more stations, we don't have a climatological perspective with those. So we can add stations all over the place, but unless they are around and are there for 20, 30, 40 years, it may fill in the gaps of where it is raining or not raining, but it doesn't give us a historical perspective of that.
Excellent. And Nancy did type in to contact Tony Bergantino. Thank you.
Tony Bergantino.
Yeah. At the Wyoming State Climate Office. So, well, that puts us at 12:31. So we appreciate everybody joining us today. And if you have any additional questions, I did put Nancy and Brian's emails in the chat box so you could quickly copy and paste them. So if you want to do that, go ahead. And thank you everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you very much.